Hello boys and girls. Today we're going to read Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you comfy? Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Small was very small. Probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your whole life. Or perhaps the smallest person you've never seen in your whole life, because he was so small you probably wouldn't see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all, so perhaps we should say that Mr. Small was as small as a pin. There's Mr. Small, he's as big as a pin. You see the size of the pin there next to him? Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath the daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it suited Mr. Small very well indeed. He liked living there. There's Mr. Small's house underneath the daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. Now this story is all about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't that many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but he hadn't had any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now whilst he was having lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. There he is with his half a pea, crumb, and just the 1 drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought whilst he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself, after lunch I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So after lunch he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for someone as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. There's Mr. Small sitting on a pebble because he's out of breath, walking to the house from the garden. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, who he knew quite well. "Out for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "Going to see Mr. Robinson," replied Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter. "About a job," added Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter, the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. There's Mr. Small and the worm. After he rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all of the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door. Nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. So there's Mr. Small and the big door. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. "How can I ring the bell when I can't reach it?" thought Mr. Small to himself. He started to climb up the wall, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He climbed up 4 bricks when he made the mistake of looking down. "Oh dear," he said, and fell. Bang! "Ouch," said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. There he is fallen. All the way down the 4 bricks worth. Just then, Mr. Small heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. The postman looked down. "Hello," he said to Mr. Small. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me?" There's the postman looking down at Mr. Small. Let's see what happens next. Will he ring the doorbell? "Of course I will," replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out, he pressed the bell with his fingers. "Thank you," said Mr. Small. "My pleasure," said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. There's Mr. Small, and he can just see the feet because he's so small. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. "That's funny," he said. "I'm sure I heard someone ring the bell." He was just about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello," said the voice. "Hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down. "Hello," he said. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Small is as high, not even as high as Mr. Robinson's shoes. "I've come to ask your advice," said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "you better come in and have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house and, perched on the arm of Mr. Robinson's favourite chair, he told him how he couldn't think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of coffee and listened. There he is with his coffee. "So you see," Mr. Small explained, "how difficult it is." "Yes, I can see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people. Mr. Robinson knew someone who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots and getting covered in mustard, so he left that job. There he is, falling into the mustard because he's so small. Mr. Robinson knew someone who worked in a sweet shop and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the sweet jars, so he left that job. There he is, fallen into the sweet jars. Mr. Robinson knew someone who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes. There's Mr. Small carrying the matches. But Mr. Small kept getting shut in the boxes with the matches, so he left that job. Oh, he's too small to do anything. Mr. Robinson knew someone who worked in a farm and arranged Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. There's Mr. Small sorting out the eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he had to leave that job. "What are we going to do with you, Mr. Robinson?" asked Mr. Small one evening. "I don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know someone who writes children's books. Perhaps you could work for him." There's Mr. Robinson talking to Mr. Small about his next idea for work. So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you?" Mr. Small asked the man. "Yes, you can," replied the man. "Pass me that pencil and tell me all about the jobs you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about it. I'll call it Mr. Small," he added. But children won't want to read a book all about me," explained Mr. Small. "Yes, they will," replied the man. "They'll like it very much." There's Mr. Small and the pencil. And you did, didn't you? You liked the book. Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves.